Little Tokyo in the mid-1970s covered just a few blocks of 1st and 2nd Street in downtown Los Angeles. But behind those storefronts, families were still pressing tofu by hand, fermenting pickles in ceramic crocks, and pounding mochi in back rooms that smelled like sweet rice flour and steam. Within a single decade, most of it had vanished, torn out by redevelopment, rising commercial rents, and a generation that moved to the suburbs and never looked back. Number 19 was served at every Japanese wedding and funeral in the neighborhood, and almost nobody under 40 has tasted it since. Number 11 used to be pressed fresh behind a shop window before sunrise, and the line started while the streetlights were still on. And number 7 came from a wooden press in a back room where the whole block could smell it before it was even finished. These were not fusion dishes or restaurant inventions. They were the daily meals that held a displaced community together for half a century. Hit subscribe, because here are 25 Japanese foods that vanished from 1970s Little Tokyo. Number 25. Tsukudani. Small dried fish and strips of kombu kelp simmered in soy sauce and mirin until they turned dark, sticky, and impossibly savory. In Little Tokyo kitchens, this was the jar that sat on the counter next to the rice cooker. Nobody bought it at a store. Grandmothers made it in large batches, ladled it into glass jars, and it lasted for weeks without refrigeration. You ate it over plain white rice when the table was otherwise bare, and it turned that bowl into something complete. The sweetness from the mirin cut through the salt just enough to keep pulling you back. By the early 1980s, the women who made it in those quantities had moved to Gardena or Torrance, and the commercial versions on the grocery shelf were a different thing entirely. Number 24. Takuan. Bright yellow pickled daikon radish, sliced into coins so firm they cracked when you bit through them. The color came from sun-drying the whole radish for days before packing it into rice bran and salt. In Little Tokyo apartment buildings, families hung entire daikon from fire escapes and balcony railings to cure in the autumn air. Neighbors on the block knew exactly which family was putting up a new batch because the fermenting bran had a smell that carried through walls. It showed up next to the rice at every meal, a sharp, salty crunch between bites of something soft. The homemade kind had a depth and funk that the plastic-wrapped supermarket version never came close to matching. When the last generation of women who hung daikon from their balconies moved away, the fire escapes stayed empty. Number 23. Natto. Fermented soybeans, sticky and pungent with long strings that stretched between your chopsticks like pulled candy. This was the dish that divided even Japanese households straight down the middle. Some families ate it every single morning over steaming rice with a raw egg cracked on top and a splash of soy sauce stirred through. Others refused to keep it anywhere in the house. In Little Tokyo, the smell alone could identify a natto household from the hallway. The traditional preparation involved fermenting the beans in rice straw bundles, a method that reaches back centuries. Most Japanese Americans born after the late 1970s never developed the taste for it, and the practice faded quietly out of daily life. The straw bundles that once carried the fermentation culture were replaced by styrofoam containers, and then by nothing at all. Number 22. Kinpura gobo. Burdock root shaved into thin matchsticks and braised with carrots in soy sauce, mirin, and sesame oil until everything caramelized into a tangle of sweet, earthy ribbons. The burdock came from Japanese produce vendors who stocked it alongside lotus root and shiso leaves. When those vendors closed and mainstream grocery stores took over the neighborhood, burdock simply was not on the shelf. Preparing it required soaking the root in cold water to pull out the bitterness, a step that took patience and a cutting board that most younger cooks were simply not willing to commit to. The dish was sturdy enough to pack into a bento box and eat cold the next day, which made it a staple for workers heading to the garment factories south of Little Tokyo. Number 21. Narazuki. Vegetables preserved in sake lees, the thick paste left over after sake is pressed. The most common version used gourd strips or small Japanese cucumbers, packed into the lees and left for months until the vegetables turned a deep amber and tasted like nothing else, somewhere between sweet, boozy, and deeply fermented. Making narazuki required access to fresh sake lees, which meant knowing a sake brewer or a supplier who imported it. When Little Tokyo's small sake distributors consolidated or closed in the late 1970s, the home supply dried up. The commercial versions shipped from Japan cost more than most families wanted to spend on a condiment. The flavor was so specific that nothing substituted for it. If you had ever tasted real narazuki, you knew instantly whether what you were eating was the genuine thing or a pale imitation. Number 20. Kuzu mochi. A simple, translucent cake made from kuzu starch, served cold with a dusting of kinako roasted soybean flour and a drizzle of dark sugar syrup. It had almost no flavor on its own. The entire point was the texture, cool and slippery with a gentle resistance when you bit through it. Kuzu starch was expensive even in the 1970s, harvested from the root of the kudzu vine and processed by hand. Japanese confectioners in Little Tokyo made kuzu mochi as a summer dessert, and it appeared in shop windows only during the hottest months. When those small confectioners retired without successors, the dessert retired with them. Factory-made versions exist today, but the handmade texture, that particular cool give against the teeth, was something a machine has never replicated. Number 19. Sekihan. Red rice made by steaming glutinous rice with azuki beans until the starches turned a deep reddish pink. This was ceremony food, the dish that appeared at weddings, births, coming-of-age celebrations, funerals, and New Year tables across Little Tokyo. The preparation was demanding. The azuki beans had to be soaked overnight, then partially cooked so their color would bleed into the soaking water, and that tinted water was used to soak the rice before steaming. Getting the color right, and even rows without muddy patches, was considered a mark of skill. Grandmothers judged each other's sekihan the way bakers judged each other's bread. Every family had a version. Some added black sesame seeds and a pinch of salt on top. Others mixed in chestnuts during the autumn months. The dish was never sweet, never rich, just fragrant and faintly nutty with the soft chew of glutinous rice and the slight bite of the beans breaking through. It was not something you could buy at a restaurant. You received it from someone who had made it for the occasion, wrapped in a lacquered box or a foil-covered plate carried on the bus. By the 1980s, the ceremonies still happened, but the sekihan came less and less often. The younger generation bought store-made red rice from Japanese markets when they could find it, and most of the time, they did not bother. The bean soaking, the steaming, the color correction, it was a full day of work for a dish that looked plain on the table. The craft behind it was invisible unless you already knew, and that was exactly the problem. The people who could see the work were the same people who no longer had anyone to make it for them. Sekihan did not disappear because it fell out of fashion. It disappeared because the hands that knew the timing were no longer in the kitchen. Number 18. Hijiki no nimono. Simmered hijiki seaweed, black and wiry, cooked with slivers of fried tofu and carrot in a sweet soy broth. The dried hijiki had to be soaked until it softened and expanded to several times its original size, then braised slowly so it absorbed the liquid without turning mushy. It was a side dish that appeared at nearly every dinner table, the kind of thing nobody noticed until the table felt wrong without it. Hijiki was rich in minerals and had a faint ocean taste that grounded the meal. When questions about trace arsenic in hijiki seaweed made international news years later, consumption dropped even further. But by then, most Little Tokyo households had already stopped making it. The seaweed sat unsold in bins at the back of the store. There is a pattern in what disappears first from an immigrant neighborhood. It is never the dishes that look impressive on a plate or the ones that restaurants put on their menus. It is always the quiet ones, the side dishes and pickles and fermented things that took patience and raw materials nobody else was selling. The food that required a whole supply chain of small vendors, each one stocking something a mainstream grocery store would never carry. When one link in that chain closed, the dish went with it. Not because people forgot how to make it, but because they could no longer get what they needed to start. Number 17. Nishime. a slow-simmered pot of root vegetables, each one cut into decorative shapes and cooked together in dashi and soy sauce. Lotus root was sliced into wheels so the holes showed. Carrots were trimmed into flower shapes. Taro was peeled and left whole. Konnyaku, a dense gray jelly made from a yam-like root, was cut into rectangles and twisted into decorative knots. The preparation took hours, and the result looked almost architectural. Nishime was holiday food, brought out for New Year celebrations and family gatherings. It was also one of the first dishes to disappear because every single ingredient required a specialty store, and the decorative cutting required a level of knife work that came from years of watching someone else do it first. The lotus root wheels alone took a steady hand and a very sharp blade. Number 16. Hand-grilled senbei. Rice crackers shaped by hand from pounded rice dough and grilled one at a time over a charcoal flame, brushed with soy sauce as they blistered and puffed. The charcoal gave them a smoky edge that factory-made senbei never replicated. Small confectionery shops in Little Tokyo made them fresh, and the smell of soy sauce hitting hot rice dough drifted into the street. A single cracker cost almost nothing. Children bought them after school. The shops that made them were gone by the early 1980s, replaced by stores selling pre-packaged crackers from Japan. The taste was close. The experience of watching someone brush soy sauce onto a cracker and hand it to you still warm was something a sealed bag could never deliver. That was the part that vanished, not the flavor, but the exchange. Number 15. Oden. A simmered pot that sat on the stove all winter, loaded with fish cakes, boiled eggs, thick slabs of daikon radish, triangles of konnyaku, and blocks of firm tofu. Everything soaking in a light dashi broth seasoned with soy sauce and a touch of mirin. Oden was not a recipe in the usual sense. It was a system. You started the pot, and you kept adding to it. A piece of daikon here, a new fish cake there. The broth deepened each day as it absorbed the flavors of everything that had passed through it. In Little Tokyo, Oden was winter itself. Small restaurants kept pots simmering behind the counter from November through March, and customers pointed at whatever they wanted. The fish cakes came from Japanese suppliers who shaped surimi paste into elaborate forms, some molded around a core of boiled egg, others stuffed with burdock root. When those fish cake suppliers scaled back or stopped importing specialty shapes, the pots grew simpler. The daikon and eggs remained, but the ornamental fish cakes that made each pot unique, the ones shaped like maple leaves or fans or spirals, those were the first to go. At home, families ran their own Oden pots for days. The rule was simple. You ate from it, you replaced what you took. A pot that started on Monday might still be going on Friday. The broth by then was something extraordinary, layered with a week of dissolved proteins and starches. That kind of patient cooking does not fit into a life measured in 30-minute dinner windows. The pot itself was a kind of calendar. You could taste what day of the week it was. Monday was clean and mild. By Friday, the broth had turned golden and thick, carrying the ghost of every ingredient that had passed through it. Nobody in a modern kitchen lets a pot run for 5 days straight. The health department alone would shut that down. But in the kitchens of Little Tokyo, that pot was the most reliable thing in the house. Number 14. Yokon. A firm, sliceable block of sweet bean jelly made from azuki bean paste, sugar, and agar. It had a dense, smooth texture that sat somewhere between gelatin and fudge, and it was eaten in thin slices alongside bitter green tea. Yokon was a gift food, wrapped in paper, and brought to someone's house as a gesture of respect. Making it at home required cooking the bean paste down until it was perfectly smooth, then setting it with agar in a rectangular mold. The homemade versions had a graininess and depth that the factory versions polished away. When the gifting culture around it faded and people started bringing store-bought cakes instead, the reason most families had for making yokon faded with it. The molds gathered dust on a shelf and the recipe cards yellowed. Number 13. Homemade miso. Not the kind from a tub at the supermarket, the kind that fermented for months in a ceramic crock in the back of a closet or on a high shelf, sealed with a layer of salt and weighted with a heavy stone. Families in Little Tokyo made miso from soybeans and koji, a rice mold that breaks down the bean proteins into deep, savory complexity over time. The process took months, sometimes a full year, and the result was different from anything commercial. Each household's miso tasted like that household. The koji ratio, the salt level, the temperature of the closet where it aged, all of it created a flavor that belonged to one family. When those families scattered across the suburbs, those crocks did not travel with them. Number 12. Umeboshi. Salt-pickled Japanese plums, wrinkled and intensely sour, often dyed a vivid red with shiso leaves during the curing process. A single umeboshi placed in the center of a bowl of white rice was called hinomaru bento because it resembled the Japanese flag. It was the most basic, packed lunch in existence, and it worked because the acidity of the plum kept the rice from spoiling in the heat. In Little Tokyo, families made their own every June when the green plums arrived briefly at Japanese markets. Missing the season meant waiting another year. The homemade ones had a sourness that made your whole face contract. Commercial umeboshi, softened with honey and additives, barely resembled them. The real ones could make you wince from across the room, and that was exactly why people loved them. The Japanese-American community in Los Angeles went through something that no other immigrant group experienced in quite the same way. During the Second World War, more than 100,000 people of Japanese descent were removed from the West Coast and placed in internment camps. When they returned, many found their homes and businesses occupied by others. Little Tokyo had been renamed Bronzeville during the war years. Rebuilding took decades, and by the time the neighborhood had fully reassembled itself in the 1960s and 70s, the next wave of displacement, this time economic, was already beginning. The foods on this list survived internment. They did not survive redevelopment. Number 11. Daifuku. Soft, pillowy mochi stuffed with a smooth ball of sweetened azuki bean paste, pressed and sealed by hand so the seam disappeared into the surface. The fresh kind, the kind that Little Tokyo confectioners made before dawn, had a texture that lasted only a few hours. The mochi skin was pliable and slightly sticky, with a chew that resisted your teeth just enough before giving way to the cool, dense sweetness inside. Making daifuku required freshly pounded mochi, still warm and elastic, dusted with potato starch so it could be handled. The filling had to be prepared separately. The azuki beans cooked, mashed, sweetened, and rolled into uniform balls. Then each ball was wrapped in a sheet of mochi and sealed shut with practiced fingers. The women who did this had been doing it for decades. Speed mattered because the mochi stiffened as it cooled. In the shop windows along First Street, daifuku sat in neat rows on wooden trays. Some were plain white, others were tinted pale pink or pale green with food coloring or matcha. A few seasonal versions appeared in spring filled with a whole strawberry wrapped in bean paste and then wrapped again in mochi. The strawberry ones became famous years later under a different name in trendy dessert shops, but the original Little Tokyo version came first, sold for a few coins from a glass case by a woman who had been making them since before the war. The strawberry daifuku required the mochi to be rolled thin enough to let the red of the berry show through, a trick that only worked when the mochi was still perfectly warm and elastic. Too cool and it cracked, too thin and it tore. The margin between success and failure was measured in seconds, and the women who could do it consistently never thought of it as a skill. They thought of it as Tuesday. Number 10. Inari sushi. Pockets of fried tofu skin, simmered in a sweet soy broth until they turned golden and slightly caramelized, then stuffed with seasoned sushi rice. The tofu pockets puffed open like small pouches, and packing the rice inside without tearing the skin was a task that required a gentle hand. Inari sushi was picnic food and bento food, the kind of thing you brought wrapped in a cloth to a park or a school event. The sweetness of the tofu skin against the tangy vinegared rice made it one of the few items on this list that children actually asked for. When families stopped making their own tofu skins and the quality of the store-bought ones thinned out and turned rubbery, the dish lost the thing that made it worth the effort in the first place. Number 9. Ozoni. The New Year soup, different in every household, built around pieces of toasted mochi floating in a clear dashi broth with vegetables and sometimes chicken or shrimp. The mochi softened in the hot liquid and stretched into long, elastic strands when you pulled it with chopsticks. Every family believed their version was the correct one. Some used white miso broth instead of clear dashi. Others added taro or fish paste. The variations mapped back to which prefecture the family had originally come from in Japan, and arguing about the right way to make ozoni was itself a New Year tradition. When the extended family gatherings that anchored the holiday shrank and the younger generation stopped coming back for the first week of January, ozoni shrank with them. A soup that fed 12 does not make sense for 2. Number 8. Nikujaga. Beef and potatoes simmered in a sweetened soy sauce broth with onions and sometimes glass noodles. This was comfort food, the dish that Japanese mothers cooked on weeknights when nothing else was planned. The beef was sliced thin and added near the end so it stayed tender, and the potatoes cooked until they just started to crumble at the edges, thickening the broth. Nikujaga was originally adapted from Western beef stew during the Meiji era in Japan, reshaped with soy sauce and mirin instead of wine and butter. In Little Tokyo, it was ordinary in the best sense, familiar, filling, and made from ingredients that required no specialty shopping. It faded not because the ingredients vanished, but because the generation that cooked it every Thursday simply stopped. Number 7. Fresh neighborhood tofu. Not the sealed blocks in water from a supermarket refrigerator. The kind pressed that morning in a wooden box in a room behind a curtain, still warm when you carried it home wrapped in paper. Little Tokyo had tofu makers who started work before dawn, soaking soybeans overnight, grinding them, boiling the slurry, straining it through cloth, and pressing the curds with wooden molds and stone weights. The texture of tofu made this way was silkier and denser than anything mass-produced, with a faint sweetness that came from the freshness of the beans. When those tofu shops closed, one by one through the late 1970s, nobody replaced them. The economics did not work anymore. A single maker producing a few hundred blocks a day could not compete with a factory producing tens of thousands. Number 6. Tsukemono. Home fermented pickled vegetables, pressed under salt and heavy stones in ceramic pots. The most common were cucumber, eggplant, and cabbage, each developing a different flavor depending on the salt ratio, the season, and how long they sat. Some families kept a nukadoko, a bed of rice bran and salt that lived in a crock and was stirred by hand every day. You pushed vegetables into the bran, pulled them out a day or two later, rinsed them, sliced them, and served them cold. The nukadoko itself was a living thing, passed from mother to daughter. Some were said to be decades old, carried from Japan and kept alive through the internment years. When a household stopped stirring its nukadoko, the bran went sour within days and had to be thrown out. Everything it carried went with it. Number 5. Onigiri. Hand-pressed rice balls, shaped into triangles or rounds, filled with a bit of pickled plum or salted salmon or seasoned kelp, and wrapped in a sheet of toasted nori. The rice had to be freshly cooked and still hot enough to mold but cool enough to handle. You wet your palms with salted water and pressed firmly enough to hold the shape without crushing the grains. The result was dense on the outside and loose enough inside that it came apart in your mouth. Onigiri was the food you handed to someone who was walking out the door, the thing wrapped in foil and tucked into a coat pocket. It required no plate, no utensil, no table. From the moment it left your hand, it was already a complete meal, portable and self-contained. What makes a food vanish is almost never that people stop wanting it. It is that the conditions which made it possible stop existing. The vendor who stocked burdock root retires. The tofu maker's lease runs out. The grandmother who kept the pickle crock alive moves into a smaller apartment. None of these are dramatic endings. They are quiet ones. And by the time anyone notices, the dish has already been gone for years. Number 4. Chirashi sushi. Scattered sushi, a bowl of vinegared rice topped with a colorful arrangement of ingredients, strips of thin egg omelet, simmered shiitake mushrooms, pickled lotus root, shrimp, snow peas, and shredded nori. Unlike the sushi Americans came to know, chirashi sushi used almost no raw fish. It was homemade celebration food, the dish that appeared at Girls' Day festivals and spring gatherings. The beauty was in the arrangement, and every topping was prepared separately before being placed on the rice in a careful pattern. Making chirashi sushi was a full morning of work. The egg alone required cooking paper-thin sheets in a square pan, rolling them tight and slicing them into golden threads so fine they looked like saffron. Every element had to be ready at the same time, and the rice had to be seasoned while still warm. By the time it was finished, the kitchen was full of bowls, and the cook was exhausted. Number 3. Dango. Chewy rice dumplings made from a mixture of rice flour and water, formed into small balls, skewered on bamboo sticks, and grilled until they blistered. Some were glazed with a thick, sweet soy sauce that caramelized over the heat. Others were rolled in kinako, the same roasted soybean flour used on kuzumochi. Dango was sold from street carts and small shop counters, 3 or 4 balls per skewer, eaten while walking. The texture when fresh was soft and yielding with a faint chew. A few hours later, the balls hardened and the window closed. Dango required making it and eating it on the same day, which made it a food that only survived when the maker and the eater lived in the same neighborhood and walked the same streets. Number 2. Hand-pounded mochi, not the ice cream kind, not the flavored kind sold in plastic trays, the kind made by soaking glutinous rice overnight, steaming it until soft, and pounding it with heavy wooden mallets in a stone or wooden mortar called an usu. The pounding was physical work. 2 people traded off, one swinging the mallet while the other turned and folded the mass between strikes. The rhythm had to be precise, or someone lost a hand. Fresh pounded mochi was warm, elastic, and so sticky it clung to everything it touched. It was torn into pieces and eaten with soy sauce and nori, or filled with sweet bean paste. Mochitsuki, the communal pounding event, was one of the last food traditions Little Tokyo held on to. By the 1990s, only a few community organizations still hosted them. Number 1. Ochazuki. Leftover rice with hot green tea poured over it, a few strips of nori on top, maybe a pickled plum, maybe a pinch of wasabi. That was the entire meal. Ochazuki was what you ate at the end of the day when the table was cleared and the kitchen was almost clean. It was too humble to serve to guests and too plain to put on any menu, but it was the dish that every Japanese household in Little Tokyo made more often than any other, because it required nothing but rice that was already cooked and water that was already hot. The tea softened the rice just enough that it slid across the bowl, and the salt from the toppings gave it all the flavor it needed. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody photographed it. Nobody thought to preserve it, because it was never supposed to be special. It was just the last thing a tired person ate before the lights went off. That bowl held more of Little Tokyo in it than anything else on this list. 25 dishes, and not one of them required a professional kitchen or an expensive ingredient list. They required a neighborhood. A tofu maker 2 blocks over, a grandmother who knew the salt ratio by feel, a produce vendor who stocked burdock root and shiso because his customers expected them. When the neighborhood changed, the dishes did not adapt. They simply stopped. If any of these sat on your family's table, the memory is sharper than any recipe could be. Leave the name of the dish in the comments.